Every empire swears its money is safe. Every government insists its promises will last forever. And every time, history proves them wrong. From the marble halls of ancient Rome to the hyperinflated streets of modern Lebanon, people have woken up to find their savings worthless, their salaries meaningless, and their futures stolen by systems they thought were bedrock. Collapse isn't rare. Collapse is the rule. We look at our bank balances, our digital portfolios, and our national currencies, and we assume they are permanent. But money is not bedrock. It is a psychological construct. Money is trust, and trust can vanish overnight. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake you can make. Every collapse leaves behind a trail of lessons, patterns, and warnings about what actually holds value and what evaporates into dust. If you pay attention to these disasters, you quickly realize that the survivors weren't the ones who trusted most. They were the ones who doubted first. Consider the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that survived for 1,000 years after the West fell. At the heart of its endurance was the gold solidus. It was a coin so impeccably reliable that merchants from Anglo-Saxon England to the markets of China accepted it without question. For centuries, it was the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. But governments possess an almost biological inability to resist the temptation to dilute their money. You would think the Byzantines would have learned from Rome's earlier disaster with the silver denarius, where emperors systematically reduced the silver content until the coin was basically worthless tin with a silver wash. They didn't. Centuries later, Byzantium made the exact same mistake with gold. Facing fiscal pressures, the emperors began shaving the purity of the solidus, stretching the gold thinner and mixing in cheaper alloys. At first, no one noticed. The coin looked the same. But eventually, trust cracked. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade for generations became just another piece of political fiction. This debasement destroyed its international credibility. And with it, the Byzantine economy lost the stability it had taken centuries to build. When the illusion shattered, paper-style decrees and imperial promises meant nothing. The merchants who survived were the ones who had quietly hoarded unadulterated gold or acquired productive land outside the imperial reach. They preserved their wealth because they held assets the state could not counterfeit. Not every economic shock comes from rulers tinkering with currency. Sometimes, the system is blindsided by nature. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the most devastating pandemic in human history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, as many as half of all Europeans died. Cities emptied, fields went fallow, and traditional trade routes simply vanished. Yet, the economic aftermath of the plague reveals a profound law of market tension. When half the labor force disappears, the cost of human labor skyrockets. Traditional feudal power dynamics flipped overnight. Survivors suddenly had leverage they had never dreamed of, demanding vastly higher wages. Meanwhile, because the population had cratered, food and land became abundant relative to the people left to consume them. For families who held liquidity, actual silver, or tangible goods, it became the ultimate buyer's market. Grand estates that once cost a fortune could be acquired for a fraction of their value because the aristocratic owners were desperate for cash to pay their newly expensive workers. If this dynamic sounds uncomfortably familiar, it should. We saw a modern iteration of this during the COVID-19 pandemic. Supply chains locked up, and governments printed trillions of dollars to keep the global economic machine from seizing. The result was a massive, fast-tracked redistribution of wealth. While those living paycheck to paycheck scrambled to cover rising rents, individuals and institutions with deep cash reserves used that liquidity to scoop up housing, stocks, and businesses at the exact moment the rest of the world was paralyzed by fear. Crises, by their very nature, ruthlessly reward those with reserves and punish those without them. The underlying lesson is clear. Institutions that look too big to fail are often the most fragile. Take Renaissance Florence in the 1340s. It was the absolute financial capital of Europe. dominated by powerful banking dynasties like the Bardi and the Peruzzi. These institutions were the gatekeepers of global credit, and they lent heavily to sovereign kings, most notably to Edward III of England to fund his expensive wars with France. When King Edward defaulted on his massive debts, the Florentine banking system didn't just stumble, it imploded. The domino effect was catastrophic. Depositors were wiped out, credit froze, and the city's thriving manufacturing economy collapsed into riots. The ordinary Florentine citizen who had trusted the safety and reputation of these mighty institutions learned a brutal truth. Too big to fail is a financial myth as old as banking itself. Corporate size is not individual safety. When these entities fall, they use your capital as their shock absorber. This pattern of structural failure repeats across continents and centuries. During the American Civil War, both the Union and the Confederacy learned that waging total war required far more capital than they possessed. Their solution was the printing press. In the North, the government issued greenbacks, paper currency backed not by gold or silver, but solely by the promise of the United States. Inflation quickly eroded their purchasing power, and public confidence wavered with every battlefield defeat. But in the South, the experiment became a tragedy. Desperate for resources, the Confederacy printed graybacks in staggering, unchecked quantities. By 1865, Confederate inflation hit thousands of percent. Salaries became meaningless before the ink on the paper bills could even dry. Families carried entire baskets of currency just to buy a single loaf of bread. When the war ended, the currency didn't just devalue, it ceased to exist. For ordinary Southerners, a lifetime of thrift and labor was completely erased. But for opportunists who had avoided the paper illusion and retained hard assets, livestock, timber, or operational machinery, the collapse was an unprecedented wealth transfer. They used tangible goods to acquire vast tracts of land from desperate neighbors for pennies on the dollar. Your money is only as good as the political structure backing it. Revolutionary France proved that political idealism cannot override basic economics. In the 1790s, after toppling the monarchy, the new revolutionary government seized the vast lands of the Catholic Church. To fund their new society, they issued a paper currency called assignats, which were theoretically backed by the value of this newly acquired national property. It seemed foolproof, but facing immediate deficits, the revolutionaries printed them with abandonment. Each new printing diluted the value of the notes already in circulation. Prices soared, wages lagged, and the assignat rapidly descended into worthless paper. Farmers in the countryside quickly grew wise to the game. They refused to sell their grain for worthless revolutionary paper, demanding actual silver or physical goods instead. In Paris, the breadlines returned, riots erupted, and the financial chaos helped fuel the reign of terror. The individuals who emerged from the revolution with their wealth intact were not the ones holding patriotic paper promises. They were the ones who held the physical property and the food supplies. 2 centuries later, the same flaw re-emerged in Asia, driven not by revolution, but by modern debt dynamics. In 1997, a speculative attack on the Thai baht triggered the Asian financial crisis. Thailand, alongside neighbors like Indonesia and South Korea, had borrowed heavily in US dollars, confident that their local currency pegs would protect them. When those pegs collapsed, their debts, denominated in foreign currency, effectively doubled overnight. Global capital fled the region in hours. Local currencies cratered, unemployment skyrocketed, and entire nations were forced to accept punishing austerity measures dictated by international lenders. The people who suffered most were ordinary citizens, whose local savings lost half their purchasing power in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, international hedge funds and foreign institutions used the crisis to buy up prime Asian real estate, corporate assets, and infrastructure at fire sale prices. Debt denominated in someone else's currency is an absolute death trap. When an economic storm hits, the creditor survives, while the debtor drowns. This brings us to the present day. If you believe these systemic collapses are confined to history books or developing nations, you are ignoring the contemporary landscape. Between 2019 and 2021, the citizens of Lebanon experienced a modern financial apocalypse. The Lebanese banking system, long praised as a stable hub of Middle Eastern finance, effectively shut its doors. Depositors woke up to find their accounts frozen. Withdrawals were restricted to tiny amounts, and the Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value. Professionals, retirees, and families watched their life savings transform into insignificant pocket change. People stood outside locked bank branches, begging for access to their own money to pay for medical care, only to be turned away. The lesson was stark. Your money in a commercial bank is not a treasure chest. Legally and practically, it is an unsecured loan you have made to an institution that can decide when a crisis hits to simply stop paying you back. The survivors of the Lebanese collapse were those who had diversified their capital outside national borders, held physical gold, or maintained liquidity entirely detached from the commercial banking architecture. Everyone else was trapped inside a burning building. The warning signs are consistently ignored until the doors slam shut. In 2008, the Western world watched its housing markets implode and retirement portfolios decimate, while the very institutions that engineered the high-risk crisis were bailed out with public funds. In 2020, global central banks printed unprecedented amounts of liquidity to stabilize economies, asset inflating the wealth of those who owned property and stocks, while leaving real wages to be eaten alive by inflation. In 2023, regional banks in the United States suffered catastrophic bank runs in a matter of hours, proving that systemic confidence is incredibly fragile. History shows there is no single magic asset that guarantees safety. In Byzantium, it was uncoined gold. After the Black Death, it was immediate liquidity. In Florence, it was distrust of concentrated banking credit. In the Confederacy, it was hard commodities. In France, it was land and food. The variables change, but the underlying narrative remains constant. Financial survival requires you to look past institutional illusions and recognize where true value resides before the system cracks. This reality presents a profound paradox. Economic collapse is a human tragedy, but it is also the ultimate catalyst for wealth migration. For the unprepared, it means total ruin. But for those who maintain resilience, liquidity, and non-counterfeitable assets, it is the precise moment where generational wealth is acquired for a fraction of its cost. True security is not merely about defensive hoarding. It is about positioning yourself to buy when others are forced to sell. It is about understanding that while paper currencies and financial institutions possess a shelf life, real production never loses its value. People will always need to eat, to build, to trade, and to survive. The individuals who can provide those tangible solutions will never be poor for long. Every financial crisis is, at its core, a massive transfer of wealth. It moves systematically from the many who blindly trusted the system to the few who prepared for its fragility. It flows away from paper promises and toward tangible, real-world value. The question is never whether the current financial architecture will fracture. History guarantees that it will. The only question that matters is whether you will be left holding a handful of broken promises, or if you will be holding something real.